For many years, America's dairy industry has been a complete mess. After decades of horrible solutions and absurd milk consumption, the country's dairy problem has only gotten worse. And I apologize to my subscribers who aren't from the United States, but perhaps you can enjoy laughing at how much cheese we're being forced to consume because of poor government oversight. So join me now for a brief history of America's horribly mismanaged dairy industry. The country's weird relationship with dairy began in the early 1900s, when doctors first started singing the praises of milk. Of course, this was also the same time that doctors were prescribing heroin to people, so it wasn't exactly an enlightened age of medicine. Nutritionists emphasized that milk was extremely important for keeping soldiers in shape, causing Americans to view milk as something of a war hero. And if there's one way to get Americans on board with anything, it's convincing them that it's somehow patriotic. By the time the Great Depression came around, many farmers were having a hard time making ends meet. The government decided to step in and help, funding farmers of certain food types. Dairy was selected to receive funding because Americans all loved it now. The government took this one step further after World War II with the Agricultural Act of 1949, which was intended to create a surplus of food for times of war. So the government began buying food directly from farmers and storing it for whenever they might need it. But since dairy doesn't exactly last long, they had to convert it all to cheese to maximize the shelf life. That's how we end up with things like American cheese, which is processed to represent how we like our food. Perhaps the most iconic form of American cheese is Kraft singles, which are so far from actual cheese that they legally have to be called a pasteurized prepared cheese product. But the 1970s were when the problems really began. As the United States experienced an economic crisis, the nation went through a dairy shortage. So President Jimmy Carter signed the Food and Agriculture Act of 1977, which poured a hefty $2 billion into the dairy industry over the course of 4 years. Meaning dairy farmers could freely produce as much dairy as they wanted, knowing that the government would simply buy up whatever didn't sell. And you don't need to be an economist to see the issue here. With every single dairy farmer milking their cows dry, the nation soon experienced a dairy surplus. By the time the 80s rolled around, the government was holding on to a shit ton of cheese. So they did the logical thing and began storing it in gigantic caves underneath Missouri, which are still in use to this day. And I'm sure you're concerned that the cheese is melting down there, but you can rest assured knowing that these caves are kept at a temperature of 36 degrees Fahrenheit at all times. Ah, the beauty of government innovation. Now, some of you die-hard members of the Grain Train might recall that I did a YouTube short about the cheese caves last year, which has earned me a whopping 9 cents. I'll try not to spend it all in one place. But the cheese caves are far from the only oddity of America's dairy industry. The government quickly realized that storing the cheese in refrigerated caves does not make it go away. By 1981, the stockpile of government cheese had reached over 300 million pounds. Secretary of Agriculture John R. Block stood in front of reporters and held up a 5-pound block of cheese that was beginning to turn green. He said, "We've got 60 million of these that the government owns. It's moldy, it's deteriorating, we can't find a market for it, we can't sell it, and we're looking to try to give some of it away." Truly a gifted salesman. I'm getting hungry just reading that quote. So the Reagan administration began giving away cheese to people with low income around the country. Over the course of the 80s, 300 million pounds of government cheese were given to the public. In the process, the cheese somehow became even less appetizing as people began to associate it with poverty. On an episode of Martha Stewart and Snoop Dogg's cooking show, Snoop said the government cheese, quote, would come in a big-ass box, and the government, if you needed some kickback, it would find its way to your refrigerator. And while the government cheese found its way to the refrigerators of many Americans, by the 90s it was no longer being given away. But there was still way too much dairy being farmed around the country, so the government opted for another strategy. In 1995, they created a company called Dairy Management, Inc., which is funded partly by dairy farmers and partly by federal tax dollars. The entire goal of the company is to promote the consumption of dairy. And that is how we ended up with the famous Got Milk campaign. For over 20 years, Dairy Management Inc. paid celebrities to pose with a glass of milk and a milk mustache, which looks like they put whiteout on their upper lip. And it was always accompanied by some text to encourage you to drink milk. Here's one where Dr. Phil tells us to get real about losing weight by drinking more milk. And here's one where a shirtless Dennis Rodman pretends that he drinks 3 glasses of milk a day. Although for him, that might actually be true. Seeing these throughout the years, as every American has, you might assume that they were advertising a specific brand of milk. But in fact, they were literally just advertising milk as a concept. So the nation that prides itself on letting the free market dictate the success of industries was now using tax dollars to pay for milk advertisements because they had made way more than the demand. And to make the whole thing more ridiculous, it barely even worked. Studies have shown that the Got Milk campaign only increased milk sales in California, while the rest of the nation remained unchanged. Meanwhile, national dairy production was still on the rise, forcing the government to buy more cheese for their caves. At the same time, more and more people were becoming lactose intolerant, or realizing that they had always been lactose intolerant and that's why their stomachs were in crippling pain. So by the 21st century, dairy consumption was decreasing while the production was increasing. But of course, regulating the dairy industry would be un-American. So the government's solution was to give more money and power to Dairy Management Inc. The company began funding studies to prove that dairy is actually good for you and we should all eat more of it. One study by a researcher from the University of Tennessee claims that the calcium in dairy causes your body to store less fat, which makes you lose weight. That's right, the calcium offsets the fat so much that a milkshake now has the same nutritional value as a glass of water. Unfortunately for Dairy Management Inc., nobody believed that. So the company went in a different direction. Instead of advertising milk to the consumers, Dairy Management decided it was better if the American people had no choice but to consume dairy. So they began working with fast food companies to integrate more dairy into their menus. And that was where they really struck gold. Since 2001, Dairy Management Inc. has worked with a number of huge fast food companies, particularly McDonald's, Taco Bell, Domino's, Pizza Hut, Wendy's, and Burger King. Since beginning the partnership, McDonald's has increased the size of their cheese slices, added yogurt and milk to Happy Meals, and replaced margarine with butter. McDonald's now has a menu in which 80% of the items contain dairy. So if you're lactose intolerant, just be glad that they haven't added cheese to the soda yet. And that was far from the most influence Dairy Management Inc. has had on fast food. In 2009, it became apparent that Americans hated Domino's Pizza. And with their sales plummeting, the company launched a controversial ad campaign in which they openly admitted that their pizza was bad. Always a brilliant marketing move. But what most Americans didn't know was that the campaign was funded entirely by Dairy Management Inc., who had partnered with Domino's to completely reinvent their pizza. And you can probably guess that the way they reinvented the pizza was by adding a lot more cheese to it. The CEO of Dairy Management at the time said, "More cheese on pizza equals more cheese sales. In fact, if every pizza included 1 more ounce of cheese, we would sell an additional 250 million pounds of cheese annually." That's why they pay him the big bucks. Over $2.5 million to be exact. Dairy Management Inc. even sent Taco Bell a full-time in-house dairy expert to work on their menu. The dairy expert, named Mike Ceresi, said his role is to bring dairy expertise to the table for the Taco Bell team. These are the jobs that our economy is based around now. Since taking on the role, Mike Ceresi has introduced such items as the grilled cheese burrito, the mango whip freeze, and the famous Quesalupa, which has 7 times more cheese than a regular taco. So yes, through a long chain of events, the Quesalupa exists because of Jimmy Carter. Ceresi was quoted saying, "It's pretty clear that Taco Bell viewed dairy, prior to the partnership, as really just a garnish, a sprinkle of cheese on top of a taco. In today's world, it's really the hero of the product." And he better hope it is, because the US government's refrigerated caves in Missouri have now ballooned to over 1.4 billion pounds of cheese. With the cheese surplus being that bad, it's easy to see why the folks at Dairy Management are working overtime. In recent years, a portion of their funds go directly to nutrition education programs for elementary school children, teaching them about the importance of having 3 servings of dairy a day. God forbid we let those obesity rates decline. To sum this all up, the government is actively running an elaborate PSYOP campaign to get Americans to eat a ridiculous amount of dairy. And the craziest part of all is that this whole thing isn't even solving the problem. Even though dairy consumption has been rising thanks to the propaganda, the dairy industry has been growing at an even faster pace. It all came to a head in 2019, when the nation's largest dairy processor, Dean Foods, filed for bankruptcy. Since then, record numbers of dairy farms have been closing around the country. So because nobody had the heart to tell dairy farmers to stop making so much dairy, the industry has finally started to fall apart after years of aggressive government support. But at least the United States managed to kick the can down the road for as long as possible, making us all fatter along the way. Now please consider subscribing or I'll lock you in the cheese caves without a jacket.